The night Epstein was found dead in his cell, the silence of the Manhattan Correctional Facility felt heavier than usual. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows across the empty hallways, shadows that seemed almost alive, stretching and bending around corners where no one dared linger. There was a chill in the air that night, a cold that crept under the skin, making every heartbeat echo too loudly against the concrete walls. Nobody outside could have imagined the layers of secrets hidden behind those steel doors, the names that would soon ignite whispers in every corner of the world. And then the first whispers began. Files had been released. Files that promised to reveal everything. But did they? Jeffrey Epstein, a man whose face had become synonymous with wealth, power, and secrecy, was no ordinary prisoner. He was a shadow among shadows, a figure whose life was intertwined with the elite, the untouchable, the famous. His victims, often silenced by fear or influence, had begun to leave fragments of their stories, scraps of truth scattered like breadcrumbs leading into a dark forest. The files, now partially exposed to the public in 2025, were said to hold the names of the powerful, the influential, the seemingly untouchable, people like Prince Andrew, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump, their names etched in documents that seemed almost too explosive to exist. Yet, exist they did. Each page in the file carried the weight of confession, accusation, and unanswered questions. Dates were scribbled with chilling precision, tracing the movements of the wealthy across private islands, secluded estates, and exclusive flights. There was a pattern that emerged, one that hinted at a network that was meticulously maintained, hidden in plain sight. The images of Epstein's properties, the layout of his planes, and the meticulous logs of visitors all pointed to a system far larger than anyone had imagined. Names were written in cursive, typed or stamped, each one sending a ripple of dread through the corridors of power. Victims' testimonies, long suppressed, painted a picture of calculated manipulation and control. Young women brought into this world of secret indulgence were groomed, monitored, and ultimately silenced, their voices muffled by the echoes of wealth and privilege. The files didn't just expose the physical evidence, they revealed the psychology of a predator who had studied influence as carefully as any academic. Each document, each ledger, each photograph became a thread in a tapestry of horror that stretched beyond Epstein himself, implicating individuals who had never faced justice. The investigation itself was strange from the start. Detectives reported odd behavior, unusual omissions, and delays that seemed almost orchestrated. Key witnesses were intimidated or disappeared from public view. Some files were redacted heavily, leaving only enough detail to hint at the names involved without confirming them fully. A sense of dread hung over every step taken to uncover the truth, as if the walls themselves whispered warnings. Some doors were never meant to be opened, and yet opening them had begun, slowly, agonizingly, in pieces that made the world shiver in disbelief. By mid-2025, fragments of the Epstein Files had leaked, revealing a labyrinthine network of meetings, transactions, and encounters spanning decades. Each new revelation seemed to deepen the darkness rather than illuminate it. The dates of flights, the names of guests, the locations of secret gatherings, all meticulously recorded. It became clear that Epstein was only the tip of an iceberg, a dark reflection of a hidden society where influence shielded the guilty and obscured the suffering of the innocent. And as the files circulated, the question lingered in every mind: how many more secrets were still buried, waiting to emerge from the shadows? The first names to emerge from the Epstein Files were accompanied by a kind of uneasy hush, as if even typing them aloud carried risk. Virginia Giuffre's testimony had long been known, yet the documents revealed far more detailed accounts of who was present, when, and where. Each entry in the ledger read like a ledger of shadows, a catalog of clandestine encounters stretching back decades. There were flight logs with dates meticulously recorded: March 10, 2001, March 23, 2002, June 5, 2003. Names that seemed ordinary, almost mundane, were connected to private islands, penthouses, and mansions across New York, Florida, Paris, and the Virgin Islands. Prince Andrew's name appeared multiple times in flight manifests, some entries accompanied by small annotations, cryptic notes that hinted at meetings with young women, sometimes underage, whose presence was recorded with the cold efficiency of accounting rather than the empathy of human concern. The dates of his visits were startling: December 2, 2000, February 15, 2001, August 10, 2001. Each time, investigators noted the same pattern repeated: wealthy men, isolated locations, and young women who would later testify about coercion and manipulation. The files suggested these encounters were not casual but systematically arranged. Bill Clinton's name appeared as well, though with fewer specific details, often listed as a passenger on private flights. According to the logs, he had traveled on Epstein's private jet on multiple occasions in the early 2000s. sometimes with Secret Service members in tow, and sometimes in odd, unrecorded circumstances. The files raised chilling questions about the true nature of these trips. What was discussed, who was present, and how much of it ever saw the light of day. Every entry left investigators grappling with the impossible. Could so many powerful figures be entangled without repercussions? The files offered no comfort, only tension. Donald Trump's name appeared intermittently, mostly in social circles and mentions of private events in Palm Beach. The files revealed invitations, notes of attendance, and sightings at gatherings where young women were often present, some identified later as victims. The annotations in Trump's sections of the file were less explicit but nonetheless suspicious, indicating an awareness of Epstein's broader network. Investigators would later describe reviewing these entries as surreal, like stepping into a theater where the audience was composed entirely of the powerful and untouchable, while the victims remained invisible, whispering in the dark corners of the room. Other prominent names emerged with equally disturbing consistency. Leslie Wexner, whose finances and property dealings were tightly woven with Epstein's operations, Alan Dershowitz appearing in flight logs and visitor lists, and Ghislaine Maxwell, whose presence in the files was central, detailing her role in recruitment and facilitation. Each mention in the files was accompanied by small notations, often shorthand, that suggested a coded awareness of wrongdoing, symbols, initials, or numbers that only those familiar with Epstein's network could understand. The documentation was exhaustive, yet chillingly impersonal, a ledger of human suffering treated as an accounting exercise as the files were slowly released in 2025. Investigators and journalists alike described the sensation of walking through a haunted archive. The paper felt cold, the pages brittle under fingers trembling with anticipation. Each new file deepened the sense of dread, a knowledge that what was revealed was only a fraction of the full horror. Behind the names and dates, the victims' lives were permanently altered, a reality that documents could not convey in full. And yet, these pages were the closest the world had come to understanding the scale of Epstein's reach, the systematic exploitation that had gone unnoticed, hidden in plain sight. For decades, the files painted a picture of a network so intricate it seemed almost impossible to believe. Epstein's properties were not merely homes, they were traps, meticulously designed to conceal and control. The Palm Beach mansion alone was described in excruciating detail. Hidden cameras in corridors, locked doors requiring special codes, guest rooms labeled with numbers instead of names. Every element was calculated, every inch of space purposed to keep secrets buried. The files revealed logs of deliveries, maintenance, and staff schedules, all indicating a system where every movement was tracked and every visitor accounted for. Walking through those rooms in your mind felt like being watched, always. Little St. James, the private island in the US Virgin Islands, was even more disturbing. The documents showed flight logs dating back to 1999, with visitors arriving on private jets from all corners of the globe. The files contained meticulous records of who stayed in which villa at what time, and for how long. Annotations in the margins hinted at activities that could never be spoken aloud. But the pattern was unmistakable. Powerful men, isolated location, young women present. It was a theater of influence and control, and the ledger read like the stage directions of a horror play no one had dared to perform until now. New York City properties were no different. In Manhattan, the Upper East Side townhouse became a central hub. Receipts, security logs, and visitor sheets documented a continuous flow of high-profile guests. Each page in the file revealed not only who was there, but also when, and sometimes, what had been discussed or arranged. The chilling aspect was how normal the records looked: typed lists, neat handwriting, ordinary paper. Only when reading them together did the scale of manipulation and exploitation reveal itself. There was no chaos, only calculated precision, and the sense that nothing escaped Epstein's gaze. Asterisk. The files painted a picture of a network so intricate it seemed almost impossible to believe. Epstein's properties were not merely homes, they were traps, meticulously designed to conceal and control. The Palm Beach mansion alone was described, in excruciating detail: hidden cameras in corridors, locked doors requiring special codes, guest rooms labeled with numbers instead of names. Every element was calculated, every inch of space purposed to keep secrets buried. The files revealed logs of deliveries, maintenance, and staff schedules, all indicating a system where every movement was tracked and every visitor accounted for. Walking through those rooms in your mind felt like being watched, always. Little St. James, the private island in the US Virgin Islands, was even more disturbing. The documents showed flight logs dating back to 1999, with visitors arriving on private jets from all corners of the globe. The files contained meticulous records of who stayed in which villa, at what time, and for how long. Annotations in the margins hinted at activities that could never be spoken aloud. But the pattern was unmistakable. Powerful men, isolated location, young women present. It was a theater of influence and control, and the ledger read like the stage directions of a horror play no one had dared to perform until now. New York City properties were no different. In Manhattan, the Upper East Side townhouse became a central hub. RIS's security logs and visitor sheets documented a continuous flow of high-profile guests. Each page in the file revealed not only who was there but also when, and sometimes what had been discussed or arranged. The chilling aspect was how normal the records looked: typed lists, neat handwriting, ordinary paper. Only when reading them together did the scale of manipulation and exploitation reveal itself. There was no chaos, only calculated precision, and the sense that nothing escaped Epstein's gaze. The files also detailed how the flights themselves were weaponized. Epstein's private jet, nicknamed the Lolita Express in the press, became a mobile extension of his properties. Flight logs revealed departures to Paris, London, New Mexico, and back to the Virgin Islands, sometimes multiple trips in a week. Passengers included celebrities, politicians, business moguls, and others whose names carried weight beyond comprehension. Each flight entry in the ledger included notations that hinted at the nature of the trip: initials, numbers, and cryptic codes indicating specific individuals and their roles. The jet became a moving stage for the web of power, secrecy, and exploitation are among the most disturbing aspects of the files, with the hidden codes and references that only insiders would understand. Some pages listed names alongside letters and numbers that seemed innocuous at first glance. A dozy said 34, but investigators suggested these were shorthand for specific girls, rooms, or events. Other pages contained markings that resembled calendars or schedules, but a closer look revealed patterns of grooming, recruitment, and movement. Epstein's network operated like a machine, and the files were the blueprint, cold and unfeeling, revealing human lives catalogued as if they were inventory. Even the mundane aspects of the network were horrifying. Catering invoices, hotel receipts, and shipping logs were interspersed with annotations of encounters and arrivals. Photographs, some blurred, some clear, depicted interiors, stairwells, and corridor spaces that would later become infamous. The files created a sense of constant surveillance, as if someone could always see, always record, always control. Every document increased the tension, the sense of dread that something was always lurking just beyond comprehension. And in that silence, one question remained: who could emerge unscathed from a network so meticulously hidden, so chillingly precise? The investigation into Epstein's network felt like chasing shadows through a foggy night. Detectives described moments of sudden silence, doors opening to empty rooms where evidence should have been, and witnesses who disappeared without a trace. Some key figures refused to testify, citing fear or secrecy agreements, while others provided fragmented accounts that only deepened the mystery. The files, now in public hands, revealed the scale of this obstruction. Hundreds of redacted pages, blacked-out names, blurred photographs, and cryptic notes. Each blank space whispered a question that investigators couldn't answer, a silent scream in the midst of official calm. One of the most perplexing elements was the timing of the certain names were removed entirely from documents dated as far back as 1998, while other entries remained fully visible. It seemed deliberate, almost surgical. Investigators noted patterns. The more influential the figure, the more heavily protected the reference. Flight logs, guest lists, and internal communications were often partially obliterated, leaving only enough information to hint at involvement without confirmation. Even today, researchers pore over these gaps, trying to reconstruct the hidden connections, the missing links that could unravel the web completely. Stranger still were the disappearances of certain witnesses. Individuals who had agreed to testify against Epstein or his associates suddenly vanished from public view. Some moved abroad, others claimed memory lapses, while a few reportedly received threats they never disclosed. The files hinted at a culture of intimidation, the subtle kind that silences before it ever strikes. Those who had been brave enough to provide evidence were often reduced to whispers in legal documents, their courage recorded on paper but their voices muffled in reality. The chilling implication was clear. The network protected itself not only through wealth but through fear. The investigators' own accounts suggested a sense of paranoia that grew with each day. Offices were quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Corridors seemed longer at night, and every shadow could be hiding a secret observer. The files indicated Epstein had a meticulous method for documenting visitors, employees, and even security personnel, keeping a record of potential witnesses in his ledger. Some entries even noted individuals who had tried to leave or speak out, cataloging them as risk factors. The sense of an omnipresent eye, a constant surveillance, permeated the investigation, turning every meeting and every document review into an exercise in dread. Journalists who managed to access parts of the files spoke of a surreal, almost cinematic horror. Every name had weight, Every date carried implications that rippled across decades. The tone of the documents was clinical, yet the content was horrifyingly personal. The contrast between the cold, factual ledger entries and the human stories they represented created a tension that seemed unbearable. Each file was like a room filled with portraits of people, some still living, some permanently silenced, their presence haunting the margins of the pages. And in that silence, the fear of what remained hidden grew heavier, perhaps. The most unnerving revelation came in the form of letters and cryptic messages embedded in the files. Some were threats, others veiled warnings, all hinting at the lengths to which Epstein's network would go to preserve secrecy. Handwritten notes, sometimes only partial sentences, suggested deals, cover-ups, and coercion. The investigators often paused over these sections, feeling the weight of history pressing down. It was a reminder that the files, as horrifying as they were, revealed only a fraction of the truth. The deeper layers, the ones deliberately hidden, were still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right or wrong person to uncover them. Asterisk. The files exposed connections that sent shivers through the corridors of power. Prince Andrew, for instance, appeared not just as a name in a ledger but as a repeated presence at private gatherings, flights, and secluded properties. Dates meticulously recorded: March 10, 2001, December 2, 2000, August 10, 2001 showed a pattern that investigators described as too consistent to be coincidence. Each entry hinted at encounters with young women, some of whom later bravely testified. The notes accompanying these logs were cryptic yet unsettling, suggesting arrangements made with cold precision, a chilling reminder that influence could mask crimes that would terrify most ordinary people. Bill Clinton's travelogues painted a similarly dark picture. Flights across the United States and abroad placed him on Epstein's private jet with passengers whose identities were sometimes blurred or redacted. Investigators were particularly struck by the meticulous timing, trips spanning multiple days, with arrivals and departures coordinated to the minute, suggesting a network of control operating far beyond the casual social gatherings previously reported. The files made it clear that these were not innocent visits. Each log entry served as a fragment of a larger, sinister puzzle, a puzzle where the edges were known but the center remained terrifyingly murky. Donald Trump's name emerged mostly in the context of parties, private gatherings, and social events. In Palm Beach, while some entries were less explicit, the files indicated that his presence overlapped with known victims, often in locations where young women were being observed, catalogued, and recruited. Investigators noted that even the indirect references were alarming: notations in the margins, initials that seemed to encode activity, and subtle references to interactions that could only make sense within the secretive network Epstein had built. The tension grew with every page turned, the shadow of power and secrecy looming larger. Leslie Wexner's role was particularly significant. The files revealed extensive financial dealings between him and Epstein, including property acquisitions that allowed Epstein to maintain his operations. Wexner's influence provided cover and credibility, a shield that let Epstein move almost freely while keeping his darkest actions hidden. Other names intertwined in the network included Alan Dershowitz, whose flight logs and visitor lists overlapped with key events, and Ghislaine Maxwell, who appeared repeatedly as a central facilitator, recruiter, and organizer. The files showed her influence as both precise and deeply insidious, a puppet master orchestrating connections and silencing threats. Each document seemed to echo with unseen voices the whispers of victims, the murmurs of fear, and the unspoken tension of those who knew too much. Flight manifests, hotel logs, and property records formed a lattice of control, linking people who were untouchable in ordinary society. Dates, annotations, and marginalia served as breadcrumbs for investigators, but the picture remained incomplete. The files were as much about human suffering as they were about privilege and power, exposing the underbelly of elite society in ways no one had anticipated. Perhaps most unnerving was the sheer audacity of the network revealed in these files. Not only were names recorded meticulously, but the activities themselves seemed systematized: recruitment, grooming, transportation, surveillance. Each piece of evidence underscored a disturbing truth. This was a deliberate, calculated system, hidden under layers of wealth, fame, and influence. And as the files continued to leak in 2025, the chilling question persisted. If these names were just the beginning, how deep did the darkness really go? How many more shadows remained hidden behind closed doors? Asterisk, asterisk, the files were not just a record of names and dates, they were a chilling testament to the lives shattered in silence. Young women, some barely out of their teens, were systematically groomed, manipulated, and coerced into Epstein's orbit. Each testimony recorded in the documents was a fragmented scream, a whisper of pain that survived despite years of secrecy. The ledger entries transformed into human stories, girls flown across continents, handed off between powerful men and left alone in cold, opulent rooms where fear was a constant companion. The pages made the cruelty almost tangible, as if the ink itself carried the weight of despair. Virginia Giuffre's accounts were especially haunting. The files detailed her movements with unnerving precision, arriving on private jets in New York on March 10, 2001, leaving for Paris 3 weeks later, and visiting Little St. James repeatedly. Notes alongside her name indicated encounters with Prince Andrew, with cryptic letters suggesting arrangements she had no control over. Reading these entries, one could almost feel the suffocating sense of surveillance, the invisible chains that bound her. Each date, each name, each location became a marker of lost innocence, a chronology of exploitation that no one should ever have endured. Other victims' experiences, less publicized but equally horrifying, were also documented. The files included notes about young women who had been recruited under the guise of modeling or employment, only to find themselves trapped in Epstein's network. Travelogues, hotel bills, and private residence entries traced their every move. Even small details, a hotel room number, a flight seat assignment, a timestamp, became evidence of control, a record of how power could manipulate and dominate without detection. The ledger read less like a document and more like a map of terror, connecting locations and individuals in a sinister web. The psychological impact on these victims, as implied by the files, was profound. Entries hinted at isolation, threats, and coercion designed to ensure silence. Notes about certain individuals included warnings or coded references, signaling that attempts to escape or speak out would not be tolerated. The network wasn't merely about sexual exploitation, it was about total domination, control through fear, influence, and wealth. Investigators described going through these documents as entering a cold, unrelenting darkness, where every recorded detail was a step deeper into human suffering that had been meticulously hidden for decades. The files also revealed the mechanisms of complicity. Some names, though not directly participating, appeared as facilitators, friends, assistants, or employees who maintained the system without confronting its horror. Each mention, whether direct or indirect, created a sense of suffocating inevitability, as if every move was preordained and recorded. The ledger entries often included shorthand, initials, or symbols that suggested an organized effort to manage victims, schedules, and movements. For anyone reading these pages, the impression was clear: nothing happened by accident, and nothing went unnoticed by Epstein's carefully cultivated network. Even with partial releases in 2025, the human costs was impossible to ignore. Every line of the files whispered of stolen years, of innocence exchanged for survival, and of lives forever altered by the shadow of a predator who seemed untouchable. The chilling reality was that behind each famous name, each flight log, and each mention, there were real people living under fear and manipulation. The ledger had become a window into a world of power used for domination, and it left a lingering unease. How many of those victims would ever see justice? And how many secrets were still buried, waiting to be uncovered in the darkness? The most unnerving aspect of the Epstein Files was not just the names or dates, but the codes scrawled in margins, the cryptic annotations that suggested a language only insiders could understand. Letters paired with numbers A12, C34, B7 appeared repeatedly, alongside shorthand notes that hinted at activities, locations, or individuals. Investigators spent weeks trying to decipher these entries, but even now, in 2025, much remains a mystery. Each attempt to interpret them felt like walking into a dark room with walls that seemed to shift and breathe, revealing only fragments and hiding the full horror just out of reach. Some pages contained calendar-like structures, filled with dates and symbols. At first glance, they resembled ordinary schedules, but a deeper look revealed patterns of recruitment, grooming, and transport, systematic, relentless, and terrifyingly organized. Certain codes were placed next to names of young women, while others appeared next to initials of powerful men. The file suggested an operation running with clockwork precision, where even the most innocuous-looking entry could conceal weeks of exploitation. Investigators described the sensation as staring at a puzzle with pieces that changed shape the longer you looked. Flight logs, too, were coded. Not every passenger was listed by full name. Some were reduced to initials, numbers, or vague descriptions. Security cameras and staff logs were also annotated in shorthand, sometimes simply OK or nah, but often with cryptic notes indicating interactions, arrivals, or even mundane events, such as catering deliveries or maintenance, carried markings that implied surveillance and control over the environment. The files made it clear: Epstein's network was not a loose collection of connections, it was a highly organized machine, every detail documented, every move calculated. Investigators were particularly disturbed by the letters and annotations referencing sessions or meetings, terms that seemed innocent to the untrained eye but, in context, carried a more sinister meaning. These notes often included combinations of names, initials, and numbers, leaving analysts to speculate on their full implications. Some entries referenced locations repeatedly, from Manhattan townhouses to the Little St. James Island estate, marking patterns of recurring abuse that the ledger coldly recorded. The meticulous nature of these records suggested a mind obsessively devoted to control, surveillance, and secrecy, and a network designed to protect the powerful while exploiting the vulnerable. Even the partially redacted portions of the files were horrifying. Pages blacked out or erased hinted at names and events too sensitive to reveal publicly, yet investigators felt the weight of what was hidden. Some missing pieces seemed deliberate, shielding individuals whose influence could alter investigations or lives. Journalists described feeling a chill when flipping through these pages, the sense that what was absent might be even more damning than what remained. Every redaction was a gap in the story, a silent acknowledgement of power wielded unchecked, a mystery left to haunt those who sought answers. The deeper the investigators dug, the more labyrinthine the network became. Not only were victims catalogued, but the people who facilitated, transported, and observed them were systematically recorded. Every annotation, every coded entry, every page left a sense of inevitability. This was not random, it was precise, deliberate, and terrifyingly efficient. And yet, even with all this documentation, the full extent of the truth remained just beyond reach. For anyone who read the files, the sensation was like standing on the edge of a dark abyss, knowing something monstrous was below, but unable to see it fully. The silence pressing in, the shadows shifting with every heartbeat. The Epstein Files revealed a global web, one that stretched far beyond Manhattan or the Virgin Islands. Paris, London, New Mexico, and even the Caribbean islands were meticulously noted, each location hosting encounters that were carefully documented, yet cloaked in secrecy. Dates paired with initials April 18, 2002, June 30, 2003 showed a relentless cycle of movement, of people traveling and being moved with precision. Flight logs, hotel invoices, and property entries hinted at a terrifyingly well-orchestrated network, one that spared no detail and left almost no accidental traces, except in the files themselves. Prince Andrew appeared repeatedly across multiple countries, his name not only in flight logs but in hotel records and private gatherings. The entries suggested interactions with multiple young women, sometimes accompanied by Ghislaine Maxwell, whose role as facilitator was clear. The files revealed the meticulous planning of these trips, arrival times, room assignments, even the management of staff to ensure that no one could witness events that should never have happened. Investigators described this as a system of control operating at a level beyond comprehension, where wealth and influence became weapons in the service of exploitation. Bill Clinton's international movements were similarly alarming. Flight manifests showed repeated visits to Epstein-owned properties abroad, with some entries hinting at private meetings away from public scrutiny. The files included annotations that suggested coordination with local staff and security personnel, ensuring that these trips could proceed without exposure. Each trip represented a potential entanglement in the network, a chilling reminder that power provided both opportunity and immunity. The ledger suggested that every flight, every arrival, was part of a pattern, a carefully maintained system of control over people and information. Donald Trump's name, though less frequent in international logs, was nonetheless present in critical moments, private events, Palm Beach gatherings, and overlapping encounters with young women whose identities were later confirmed as victims. The files suggested indirect awareness or involvement, often through shared social circles and private functions. The notations accompanying these mentions were cryptic yet unnerving, signaling a network where influence intersected with secrecy and control, and where the lines between privilege and complicity became dangerously blurred. Every entry seemed to thrum with the tension of unspoken crimes. Leslie Wexner, Alan Dershowitz, and other powerful figures were repeatedly referenced, their roles spanning financial, logistical, and social domains. Wexner's property dealings were intertwined with Epstein's operations, providing a base for events that would later surface as part of the investigation. Dershowitz's appearances in flight logs and visitor lists suggested a deeper entanglement than previously acknowledged, though redactions left the full scope unknown. Each reference reinforced the sense of a network functioning like a hidden society, carefully maintained by wealth, secrecy, and a system of unspoken rules designed to protect those at the top. Even more chilling were the repeated references to unknown individuals, people whose names were blacked out or coded in ways investigators could not fully interpret. These entries suggested the presence of others whose influence and participation remained hidden, a reminder that the files, though vast, were incomplete. Each redacted page, each coded annotation, increased the sense of unease, revealing the sheer depth of secrecy maintained over decades. For anyone reading, the files were less a record of crime than a living, breathing manifestation of power, manipulation, and terror, an abyss into which the curious could peer, but never fully comprehend. Despite the revelations in the files, investigators often found themselves facing walls of silence and frustration. Key witnesses disappeared or refused to testify, leaving entire sections of the ledger unresolved. Some vanished overseas, others withdrew suddenly from public life, and a few reportedly received threats that kept them silent. Every dead end created a sense of unease, a creeping fear that the network had eyes and ears in places no one could anticipate. The files documented not only the crimes but the barriers erected to prevent truth from emerging, an invisible shield protecting the powerful while the victims remained unheard. Mysterious anomalies cropped up in the documents themselves. Pages would appear out of order, dates would skip without explanation, and annotations sometimes contradicted other entries. Investigators described feeling as though they were navigating a shifting maze, where the walls moved with every step. Security logs sometimes recorded the presence of staff or guests that did not appear elsewhere, raising questions about deliberate cover-ups or false records. The ledger was precise, yet chaotic in its omissions, leaving a persistent sense of something lurking just beyond comprehension. There were also eerie consistencies in the files that suggested a methodical awareness of scrutiny whenever the involvement of extremely high-profile individuals was noted. Entries were heavily redacted, smudged or written in shorthand. It was almost as if Epstein or whoever maintained the records had anticipated discovery, building layers of obfuscation into the system itself. Investigators reported a strange psychological weight while reviewing these entries, the sense that the documents were observing them as much as they were observing the network. Each blank space, each blank name carried a silent threat. Some truths were guarded jealously. The disappearances were not limited to witnesses alone. Certain staff members, flight crew, and even security personnel referenced in the files became unreachable or uncooperative. Some left quietly under strange circumstances, others claimed memory lapses, while a few simply vanished. The files documented these departures with notes like "no longer available" or "status unknown," a subtle acknowledgement of how the network maintained itself even when key players exited. Each vanished person left a gap in the investigation, a blank space where clarity should have been, reinforcing the eerie notion that the system was self-preserving, and that those who sought to uncover it were always at a disadvantage. Investigators also discovered odd coincidences within the timeline of events. Deaths of individuals connected tangentially to Epstein, sudden resignations, and mysterious relocations seemed to coincide with critical dates in the ledger. Flight logs, property, inspections, and hotel stays were all meticulously timed, suggesting an almost supernatural ability to control circumstances. Each of these anomalies compounded the sense of unease, hinting at forces operating behind the scenes that were never fully documented, never fully explained, but always deeply unsettling to those who tried to follow the trail. And yet, for all the dead ends and anomalies, the files continued to demand attention. They were a window into a hidden world of influence and exploitation, revealing a network that had long been shielded from accountability. Every missing piece, every coded annotation, every redacted name reinforced the chilling reality that this was far from over. For investigators, journalists, and the public alike, the question remained: how much of the truth had been lost, and how much still lingered in the shadows, waiting to be unearthed? The ledger did not answer it, only whispered, darkly, in silence, asterisk. As the files spread across newsrooms and private desks in 2025, darker theories began to surface, whispered late at night in empty offices lit only by computer screens. Some investigators believed Epstein was never just a predator, but a collector of secrets. The meticulous documentation, the coded ledgers, the careful tracking of powerful individuals all pointed towards something colder and more calculated. The files read less like trophies of indulgence and more like insurance policies, a silent threat hanging over anyone whose name appeared within those pages. The idea was chilling. Epstein may have been protected not because of ignorance, but because of leverage. One theory suggested the files were never meant to be fully destroyed. Certain documents appeared duplicated, stored across multiple locations, both physical and digital. Investigators noted identical codes and annotations, appearing in different binders, as if backups had been deliberately created. This raised a disturbing possibility that even after Epstein's death, the network remained alive, guarded by those who understood the value of what he had collected. The sense of being watched lingered heavily over anyone who studied the files too closely, as if the past was still breathing down their necks. Another unsettling pattern emerged around intelligence connections. Some entries referenced foreign travel that coincided with diplomatic events, international summits, and closed-door meetings. The overlap was subtle, easy to dismiss, but impossible to ignore once seen. The files hinted at Epstein's access, two circles far beyond finance or celebrity, suggesting a man who moved through layers of power with unnatural ease. Investigators described feeling a slow dread as these patterns revealed themselves, realizing that the story might stretch into places no one wanted to look. There were also theories about Epstein's death itself, the timing, the missing footage. The malfunctioning cameras, all documented indirectly in the files, rekindled suspicions that his silence was convenient. Notes written close to the date of his death referenced risk escalation and containment, phrases that felt ominous in hindsight. For many, the files did not prove murder, but they painted a picture of a system where certain outcomes were quietly allowed to happen. The cell, the silence, the unanswered questions all became part of the larger unresolved nightmare. Some believe the files were intentionally released in fragments, a slow drip designed to test public reaction and protect certain individuals. Each partial disclosure seemed to reveal just enough to shock, but never enough to fully satisfy. Investigators and journalists spoke of pressure, subtle and direct, but persistent, to move on, to focus elsewhere. The effect was suffocating, as if the truth was always within reach, but never allowed to be grasped fully. The darkness wasn't just in what was revealed, but in what was carefully withheld by this stage. The Epstein Files had become something more than evidence. They were a symbol of how power can distort reality, how silence can be engineered, and how truth can be buried under layers of influence. Each theory, each whispered suspicion, added to the sense that the full story might never emerge. And as the shadows deepened around the unanswered questions, one thing became clear. Whatever Epstein truly was, his shadow had not died with him. It lingered, heavy and watchful, waiting in the gaps between the pages. Asterisk, asterisk. By the time investigators reached the later sections of the files, the atmosphere around the case had changed completely. What once felt like an exposure now felt like a warning. The documents no longer read as historical records, but as living artifacts as capable of damaging careers, collapsing institutions, and destabilizing reputations built over decades. Officers reviewing the files reported heightened security, restricted access, and an unspoken rule. Some pages were safe or unread. The silence surrounding the most sensitive names grew thicker, heavier, as if the air itself resisted the truth. The media coverage in 2025 reflected this unease. Headlines spoke loudly at first, then slowly stories disappeared. Mid-cycle journalists who pushed too hard found themselves reassigned or sidelined. The files hinted at this pattern to entries marked with notes like media risk or contain exposure, suggesting that reputation management was always part of the operation. It became clear that Epstein's power hadn't ended with his arrest or death. It had simply changed form, spreading outward through influence, pressure, and fear behind closed doors. Some investigators admitted the case felt unwinnable. The deeper they went, the more resistance they encountered. Requests for additional documents were delayed. Access to certain archives was denied without explanation. Even digital records appeared altered or incomplete. The files themselves seemed to anticipate this resistance, as if they were designed to reveal just enough to horrify, but never enough to dismantle the structure entirely. Every step forward was met with an invisible hand pushing back. There was also a growing sense that justice had become selective. Lesser figures faced consequences, while the most powerful names remained suspended in ambiguity. The files reflected this imbalance clearly. Full names reduced to initials. Entire pages blacked out, timelines abruptly ending when they approached influential circles. For the victims, this partial truth was almost as painful as silence. Their suffering was acknowledged, but accountability remained distant, wrapped in legal language and institutional hesitation. Some who reviewed the files described a psychological toll that lingered long after the pages were closed. Sleepless nights, recurring images of empty rooms and private jets, the constant feeling that something was unfinished. The documents didn't just expose crimes, they exposed how systems protect themselves, how influence bends outcomes, how truth can exist in plain sight and still remain unreachable. The horror wasn't just what happened, but how resilient was allowed to continue. As 2025 moved forward, the Epstein Files settled into a strange limbo, public yet untouchable, known yet unresolved. They sat like a locked door everyone could see, but no one could open fully. And in that stillness, a final, unsettling realization took hold. The most dangerous part of this story might not be what was written in the files, but what they were designed to never reveal. The final pages of the Epstein Files felt colder than the rest, as if the paper itself carried a memory of everything it refused to say. What remained was not closure, but a hollow space where answers should have lived. The names that appeared were powerful, but the names that did not appear felt even heavier. Redactions stood like gravestones, marking truths that were deliberately buried. Investigators described closing the files slowly, aware that they were stepping away not from the end of a case, but from the edge of something far larger, darker, and unfinished. Epstein's death did not silence the questions. It amplified them. The missing footage, the quiet failures, the perfectly timed breakdowns all lingered like a low hum in the background of every revelation. The files suggested preparation, anticipation, a man who understood exactly how dangerous his knowledge was Whether he believed he would survive or not no longer mattered. What mattered was that the system he moved within remained intact, breathing quietly behind layers of law, wealth, and institutional caution. For the victims, the files were both proof and punishment. Proof that what happened to them was real, documented, undeniable. Punishment, because even with that proof, justice felt distant and fragile. Their lives were altered forever, while many of the names connected to their trauma continued forward, untouched, unaccountable. The imbalance echoed through every page, a reminder that truth alone is not always enough to bring consequences. The public left with fragments began to understand the deeper horror. This was not just one man's crime. It was a mirror reflecting how easily power shields itself, how silence is manufactured, and how accountability can be endlessly delayed. The Epstein Files did not scream their secrets. They whispered them, trusting that those who listened closely would feel the weight of what was missing as much as what was revealed. Even now, the story refuses to rest. New documents surface, old questions resurface, and the same uneasy patterns repeat. Every time the case is mentioned, there is a pause, a hesitation, as if something invisible is standing just behind the conversation. The shadows remain long, the silence remains deliberate, and the truth remains incomplete. The Epstein Files close without resolution, leaving behind a feeling that never quite fades. A sense that some doors were opened just enough to prove what lay behind them, but never enough to step fully inside. The darkness lingers, not in the past, but in the unanswered present, where power and secrecy still walk side by side. If you found this story chilling, subscribe for more mysteries, because some cases are never closed.